What is up, everybody? This is Erik, the one and only Bear Collector, and today I'll be reviewing a game that is very memorable to me. It's a childhood memorable game, but it's also considered to be an all-time favorite, an all-time great for the console that I'm going to be talking about, and it's definitely true in my opinion. And I know that I was thinking that this game was expensive to own, but the prices were fluctuating, so I didn't label it as such. And that game is a legend, the one and only Contra for the NES. Now, the game is made by Konami. It came out in arcades in 1987. Then a year later, it was ported over to the NES in 1998. And you play as Bill and Lance out to Seven Island off of New Zealand that has been overtaken by the Red Faction Army, I believe. But of course, it ends up being aliens. So it's like an alien race that's trying to take over humanity. The game consists of 8 levels. It is a side-scrolling platformer, run-and-gun game, as well as a first-person game, and it's a lot of fun. It's you collect power-ups to get different weapons, but it is very difficult. One hit and you die type of difficult, and you only get a couple of continues. Now, why do I have it like this? Well, I don't own an NES copy of the game. I do own it through this cartridge and a lot of other media. This one, the infamous 509-in-1 Legendary Games. No, it's not pictured there. Yeah, it is. Oh no, but that's the other Contra. That's another story for another day. So, yes, I own it through that, but I also own it through the Xbox One as the Contra collection. So it features this one, Super C, and all the other ones. But focusing on this particular game, it is a very fun game, very difficult. However, you have the infamous Konami code that gives you 30 lives. If you press on the title screen, up, up, down, down, left, right, BA, and start. That is where that code originated from, or got its fame from, because you can use it in a lot of other Konami games, and it'll probably give you special power-ups or other things. I know as far as Contra and Super C, I think it works for both games. I know I have like I think Life Force is by Konami. I think you can use that code in there too as well. So you can use it in a lot of games and try it out. But yes, I own it as part of that Contra collection as well as that. Now, it's memorable in many ways. One of the things is, back in the days, I used to play this one with my cousins because they had a copy. And of course, you can play 2-player at the same time. And it was difficult, but it was fun to play. And much more recently right now, my friend came to visit from out of town this past February, and we whipped out the game through the Xbox One, and we try to challenge ourselves to see how far we can get this, even though we use the Konami code. And I got a little bit further. I think he got almost about the same, but we didn't get quite there. So then the next time that I was getting ready to do the gameplay footage of the game, I challenged myself to do that just using the Konami code and try not to do as many continues, because I wasted them when I was playing the one on the Xbox One. And fortunately, I beat the whole game. So the video gameplay that you're going to see is going to be a full gameplay through of the game. So yeah, I actually used the code, got through the game, and was able to pass it. But I had a lot of fun playing it, and it brought back a lot of memories and built new ones with my friends. So yes, hope you guys enjoy the gameplay footage of the game. I had a lot of fun with this one. Of course, there's other Contra games out there. This is by far not the only one. So in future videos, I'm pretty sure I'm going to cover the other ones as well. There is one Contra, I think Contra 4s for the NES. I used to own a copy of that one. It's a very expensive game to own. I have it on this cartridge, and which is the one that's pictured there. If you can see it right there. I'm going to try to see if I could beat that one, because that one I could not beat. I believe I beat Super C a long time ago, but that one was one that always held me back. But anyways, that's a story for another day. Hope you guys enjoy the full gameplay footage of the game. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.
Hey everyone, it's me, Erik the Bay Area Collector, back in robot form for a bit. I apologize for this, but I need to share one more thing that I thought was important before I start the gameplay footage of the game that I forgot to mention, and that is the different versions of Contra that came out in other regions and consoles. The arcade and NES versions are very similar in gameplay, however the arcade version is a little bit shorter, much harder, and of course the title screens are different. The Famicom version is the one that impressed me the most. That one has cutscenes as well as an introduction about what the game is about. This version also has a map to show you where you are in between levels. This version looks very cool, but otherwise plays the same as the NES version. The title screen also shows this very cool graphic animation on the letter C in Contra. In Europe, PAL regions, the game came out 2 years later after the NES version and was titled differently, and the game was known as Probotector. They changed the main character look to look more like androids and robotic, and some of the enemies were changed to look robotic as well. The reason for that was due to war conflicts that was going around Europe at that time in certain areas, so they wanted to eliminate the human look to make it less realistic to tone down the violence. The series became known as Probotector in that region, and it carried on through all the Contra games until the game Contra Legacy of War came out and they dropped the Probotector name. Other than that, the games are all the same as the versions released here in the US. The final version is the MSX2 version. That one was different, in which the game doesn't scroll automatically, it instead goes from screen to screen, as well as the character has a life bar and a couple of lives. The other unique thing was the weapon upgrades. When you receive one, the game gives you an option to choose your regular weapon or take the brand new weapon, and it even kind of pauses the screen as you make the selection. Anyways, these are all the different versions of the game Contra that are available. There were other versions for the home computers, for example, the Commodore 64, but those were more of toned-down versions of the arcade game. Konami even allowed the European versions of those to be distributed by Ocean Software. I especially like the Famicom version because I was impressed with the introduction and cutscenes that it has. I wish it would have been the same as the NES version, however the reason why they couldn't do it was because of the chip processing of the game, and it was much more harder to develop and put it out over in the US. Anyways, this has been Erik, the one and only Bay Area Collector, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.